Good evening. My name is Amy Milligan, and I am the director of Old Dominion University's Institute for Jewish Studies and Interfaith Understanding. We're delighted that you have joined us tonight to learn with Dr. Jenny Caplan as she presents her work, Bam Pow Oi, Jewish Comic Book Characters. A few quick housekeeping notes. Because of the size of the audience, which is a wonderful problem to have, we ask that you stay muted during our lecture. Dr. Kaplan will be spotlighted so that you can see her and her screen. Also, please use the chat function for your questions and comments. During the Q&A period after Dr. Kaplan's presentation, we'll be taking moderated questions from that chat box and not unmuting for questions due to the size of the audience. Dr. Kaplan will see all of your questions and comments, so if she is unable to directly answer you during the Q&A, she will still hear your ideas about her work. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jenny Caplan. Dr. Caplan is an assistant professor of religious studies and the program director for Jewish studies at Towson University. She received her PhD from Syracuse University after attending Wellesley College and Harvard Divinity School. Her work is primarily on American Judaism and pop culture, and her forthcoming book on American Jewish humor will be published with Wayne State University Press. She has several recent and forthcoming publications on comics and graphic novels, and this research is the foundation of her next major project. She is a lifelong geek who is proud of her ability to turn reading and watching the stuff that she likes into a legitimate academic pursuit, something that we all hope for, Jenny. Will you please join me tonight in warmly welcoming Dr. Caplan?
Thank you, Dr. Milligan. Hi, everybody. I am going to share some images in the background here, so give that a second to boot up. I'm so happy to be here tonight and have the opportunity to talk about this with all of you. And I will just say before I get started that there are points in the presentation where the slide will go black. That is normal. You are not missing anything. It's just a point at which I was talking for a few minutes without any images to go along with it. And so I didn't want you staring at something that I wasn't talking about. So don't worry if there are black slides. In fact, I will go ahead and put one up right. Nope, no, I won't. I lied. Haha. Live theater, folks. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So this is a story about masks, about what we reveal to who and when, about the fear of the unknown and the leap of faith it takes to show someone your true self. Putting on or taking off a mask is an almost sacred act within the pages of comic books. The mask is the thing that separates, that protects, and that creates the liminal space in which an alter ego exists. I use what I call masking theory to think critically about both what it means to have a secret identity and how Jewish comic book characters have had their Jewishness masked and unmasked throughout their history. Masks do not all work the same way. Bruce Wayne wears a mask so that people do not know that he is also Batman, but Clark Kent is the mask that Superman wears to hide his otherness. Characters don masks for many reasons, but the most common is to hide something about themselves that they do not think society would understand. Sometimes they are protecting the reputation and family of the real person under the mask, but not always. Superman hides in plain sight as Clark Kent, just as Wonder Woman hides as Diana Prince. They are hiding their inhumanity, while Bruce Wayne and Peter Parker hide their humanity. The mask is always a defense mechanism, but it's not always defending the same thing. In this talk, I'm focused not only on the characters, but also on the comic book authors themselves, and about what we can infer about them based on what masks they apply to their creations. The masking and unmasking of Jewish characters speaks to what Rachel Cranston calls the ambivalent embrace between post-war American Jews and middle-class American identity. For this talk, I'm going to focus primarily on 4 characters: the Thing, Magneto, Ragman, and Kitty Pryde. Drawing on Tom Morris's work on secret identities, as well as other contemporary theories of comics and graphic novels, I argue that for 3 out of the 4, it's been their Jewishness that has been their secret identity, at least as much as their real name. I'm beginning with the Thing because his mask is the least stereotypical. His identity was never a secret. So if, as Morris argues, a secret identity is an integral part of the superhero genre, then the Thing allows us to ask what his secret may be. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created the Thing, and they and other Jewish writers like them may have been masking themselves as they were masking their characters. While fear of exposure may have driven art to imitate life, secret identities are nevertheless powerful, in part because they open up space for more personality, more diversity, and more exceptionality. A character with two separate yet fully formed identities offers greater space for writers and artists to explore social and political issues. And yet there can be downsides to keeping certain parts of a character hidden or masked. In The Secret of Secret Identities, Tom Morris writes, quote, "For most superheroes, a dual identity is primarily about masking. The costume and the superhero persona keep a secret," end quote. Masking is substantially different from both hiding and making invisible. Masking is about taking something obvious or apparent and covering it in such a way as to obscure it. Nevertheless, a mask does not remove the fundamental truth that lies beneath. Masking is generally about protection. Masking tape, for example, protects the surface below from paint. Masking does not change what sits below the mask, and it does not remove it permanently. A mask simply diverts the eye, or the paint, for a brief time until it's removed, and the underlying reality is once again revealed, unchanged and unharmed. Therefore, when a superhero wears a mask, the version of her that sits below the mask exists simultaneously with the version of her that wears the mask. She's not undergone a fundamental change by donning the mask. This is why masking would not be an appropriate way to describe the difference between Bruce Banner and the Hulk. Banner is functionally gone when the Hulk is present, and vice versa. In masking, you can only cover something, not eliminate it. I want to push Morris's ideas even further. Morris sees secret identities in a narrow way. Everyone knows who the Invisible Girl is, Morris writes. It's Sue Storm. She doesn't try to hide her real identity. In the same way everyone knows that Reed Richards is Mr. Fantastic. They don't attempt to use their flashy outfits or catchy new names to mask their true original identities, end quote. Sue Storm and Reed Richards are two members of the Fantastic Four. The third member of that team is Sue's brother Johnny, and the final member is Ben Grimm, one of the characters we'll be discussing tonight. It's telling that Morris instinctively uses the two members of the team who, one could argue, have the least to hide in their true original identities. Sue and Reed remain relatively human when they transform. Most Fantastic Four artists have depicted Sue's invisibility by showing her same body shape, just colored blue or opaque in some way. While Johnny, and especially Ben, become terrifying and even monstrous. They have much more to lose through exposure, and it's therefore unlikely that their identities being common knowledge means, as Morris speculates, that they have no mask at all. In this, Ben Grimm is not alone. Monstrosity is an important part of what many comic book characters are masking. Many characters feel, whether rightly or not, that their other self is a monster, either physically or because of their powers. They feel abnormal, and they therefore mask themselves to keep those they love from abandoning them. As Linda Sariello writes, quote, "The monster is deployed to symbolize that which threatens or has gone wrong in society or within an individual. That which, once fixed, will result in the restoration of social order," end quote. The more monstrous a character's other self is, the more likely she or he will feel the need to hide or mask because there's an assumption of moral failing that accompanies monstrous bodies. Ben Grimm, unlike the other members of the Fantastic Four, is stuck as the Thing permanently. He cannot mask his physical monstrosity. So if he's not masking his real name, and he cannot mask his monstrosity, what is he masking? What is he keeping secret or protecting from being associated with a monster such as him? Physical monstrosity, however, is not the only kind of monstrosity, and characters have often masked other perceived character flaws or weakness because of the perception of imperfection. Characters have masked queerness, for example, or ethnic difference, and have passed as straight or passed as white as part of their masking. Ben Grimm is one of many characters for whom masking and passing involved hidden or unproclaimed Jewishness as well. Tonight, I will use masking to describe one common way that Jewish comic book writers and artists both conformed to and subverted social norms. In Disguised as Clark Kent, Danny Fingeroth writes, quote, "As part of their assimilation into America, Jews became deeply involved in creating the modern myths that infuse pop culture," end quote. Yet, he says many of the Jewish creators of comic books argued that their personal Jewishness was not important, or that they were just telling universal stories. According to this viewpoint, he says, if there was any Jewish mythological basis for the superheroes that emerged from comics, it was fueled by the same Bible tales to which every child in Western society is exposed, as often as not in a non-religious, non-ethnic context, end quote. Stan Lee once even tried to claim that the abundance of Jews in the comic book industry came as a surprise to him, or was something he had never noticed. When asked during an interview about whether his Jewishness informed his art, he responded, I have no idea. I never really thought of it. It's strange when you mention it that the best known characters were done by Jewish writers. I guess that is an odd thought. Artists and creators are constantly masking and revealing, whether they realize it or not. And masking theory can be applied to any situation in which someone is choosing what to reveal about themselves. It creates a language for a systematic critique of the way public figures choose what personal information to reveal and when. By thinking about these choices in terms of what is being protected or masked and what is being gained by removing a mask, we can approach the narrative of coming out in a theoretically constructive manner. There's a great deal of important information that can be gleaned about both a character and a creator by what a character reveals, what they mask, and when they are open or hidden about certain things. Visible and invisible monstrosity drive characters to behave in certain ways to protect themselves and those about whom they care. And there have been many characters whose Jewishness was masked by their creators. I argue that this was not because Jewishness was seen as monstrous, but because the characters were protecting the Jewish community from negative associations. Stan Lee was born Stanley Lieber, and Jack Kirby was once Jacob Kurtzberg. As Ari Caplan explains this phenomenon, quote, "It would be easy to say that these people changed their names out of hatred for their own ethnicity, but that just isn't true." Caplan argues that the name changes came from a fear of anti-Semitism, but interviews with Stan Lee tell a different story. He often talked about the fact that he was saving his real name for his eventual Pulitzer Prize-winning Great American Novel. He changed his name because he didn't want his real Jewish name associated with something as lowbrow as comics. He once said, quote, "People had no respect for comic books at all. Most parents didn't want their children to read them." Therefore, while many Jews undoubtedly did change their names out of fear of discrimination, there was also a sense from those within the comics community that what they were doing wasn't good art, and it wasn't good for the Jews. The origin story, to use comic book terminology, for masking theory comes out of several trends in post-World War II America. And two documents, published within months of each other, expressed the conflicting forces that would shape the development of the comic book industry as it moved into the pivotal Silver Age, generally dated from 1956 to 1970. This was the period during which Stan Lee and Jack Kirby grew Marvel Comics into a juggernaut, no pun intended, and artists like Joe Kubert at DC Comics responded by changing their approach to match Marvel's. These formational documents were the first iteration of the Comics Code Authority in 1954, and Will Herbert's Protestant Catholic Jew in 1955. In April of 1954, in the face of growing fears about dark, macabre, occult, and gruesome content of many comic books, the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency convened a hearing on the comics industry to determine whether the government needed to step in and regulate the content. The major comics publishers decided to get ahead of the problem and self-regulate, much like the film industry had done with the Motion Picture Production Code, often called the Hays Code, in the early 1930s. So in the fall of 1954, the major publishers agreed on the first instantiation of the Comics Code Authority guidelines. The CCA seal was a sign that nothing truly disturbing or immoral was depicted in an individual comic. And the hope was that by self-regulating, they could keep Congress from imposing sanctions from above. The CCA addressed comics' image problem in two ways. First, it effectively forced the more objectionable publishers out of business. The horror and true crime series could not clean up their content enough to stay on the right side of the CCA, so those titles could not bear the CCA seal. Parents had immediately begun to look for the CCA seal, assuming that it meant that that book contained largely wholesome content. So those publishers that could not or would not adhere to the CCA quickly folded. Secondly, it set standards that the remaining publishers promised to uphold. And as it was self-imposed, the idea was that they would keep each other accountable. The code was extensive, and in hindsight, it appears almost silly at points. Crime and criminals could not be presented sympathetically. The details of a crime could never be shown. Policemen, judges, and government officials could not be mocked. Kidnapping couldn't be shown. No comic could have the word horror or terror in its title, and zombies, vampires, ghouls, and werewolves were all prohibited. The code regulated dialogue, costumes, romance, and myriad other facets of storytelling. In addition, slipped in amongst the other rules was one sentence: ridicule or attack on any religious or racial group is never permissible. In and of itself, this seems innocuous. Publishers, however, were so afraid of violating these standards that they often opted to omit certain topics altogether, rather than risk a title not receiving the CCA seal. Religion, and especially it seems Judaism, was one of the most feared taboos. David Zuralik writes about a similar phenomenon in regards to television, and argues that the reason there were no Jewish characters on television for the better part of 30 years was a fear of surplus visibility on the part of the Jewish network executives. Zuralik says that surplus visibility is, quote, the feeling among minority members and others that whatever members of that group say or do, it is too much, and moreover, they are being too conspicuous about it. As post-World War II Jews, Jewish comic book creators, like Jewish television executives and writers, were afraid to remind people that they were there, much less that they were in power. Better to keep Jews hidden and under the radar rather than potentially incite anti-Semitism. The desire not to upset the status quo is intrinsic to the tripart society Will Herberg described in 1955, when he wrote about the way the American Protestant majority had found balance with the Catholic and Jewish minorities. Herberg describes a Jewish community who, while not assimilating per se, had taken pains to keep religious difference out of the public eye. It is not difficult to understand, Herberg wrote, why an extreme secularism and separationism should appeal to so many American Jews as a defensive necessity, end quote. There was safety in being part of the mainstream, but many Jews thought their position in the mainstream was tenuous and depended on their apparent conformance when compared with the Protestant norm. This could be why, even when other religious characters had become popular, such as Daredevil in 1964 and Nightcrawler in 1975, both of whom have Catholicism as an important part of their backstory, publishers remained afraid to depict conceptually Jewish characters. There were characters with coded or possible Jewish backstories, but explicitly Jewish characters were essentially non-existent. These fears of surplus visibility and the reality of Jewish self-censorship created the environment within which Ben Grimm came to life. When Stan Lee created the Fantastic Four in 1961, he set out to change the narrative about superheroes. Superhero comics in the 1950s had been dominated by Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and a handful of others who conformed in one way or another to Morris's ideas about masking. Some of them put a mask on to be normal, like Superman or Wonder Woman. Some of them put a mask on to be extraordinary, like Batman, but all lived lives that were divided between their two selves, lives in which they deceive and even lie to those closest to them to protect or shield others from the dangers that accompany being a caped crusader. Grant Morrison, in his comic book history, Super Gods, mentions that the normalcy of Stan Lee's Silver Age creations was part of what made them sensational. Quote, these new Marvel heroes dressed like us, even though they had fantastic physical abilities. The exploration of their constantly shifting, always familiar family dynamic made them a perpetual motion story machine, end quote. The Fantastic Four, unlike the Superman or Batman style hero who kept his two selves separate, were open about their duality. They were astronauts exposed to radiation on a mission, and they came back with new mutant abilities. So there was never a question of keeping their powers secret or having their new alter egos be unknown. It was public record. Sue Storm, the Invisible Girl, came back, as her name implies, with the ability to become invisible, while Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, gained the ability to stretch and contort his body to impossible degrees. If we use monstrosity as a metric for goodness, both Sue and Reed remain clear good guys. Sue is the least monstrous of the four, as she simply moves between visible and beautiful, and invisible, but ostensibly still beautiful. Reed's body does take on monstrous proportions at times, but his classically attractive face was rarely transformed. Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, becomes engulfed in flames when he activates his powers, but when he turns them off, he returns to his boyishly good looks. Only Ben Grimm, the pilot and fourth member of the team, is truly a monster. He becomes the Thing. As Morrison writes, quote, Ben drew the short straw as his reward for trying to prevent this whole insane escapade from ever taking place, when he transforms into the monstrous orange-plated Thing, unable to ever return to his human form, end quote. This is what makes Ben Grimm such a compelling case study in secret identities. Everyone knows that Ben Grimm is the Thing. However, just because everyone knows that Ben Grimm is the Thing does not, contrary to what Tom Morris speculates, mean that he's not still masking, not still covering up, and not still hiding elements of who he really is. Ben is the only one of the four who is stuck in his mutant, monstrous form. While Sue can be visible or invisible, and Reed can have normal human proportions or elongated ones, and Johnny can flame on or not, Ben is always the Thing. A giant rock monster who looks terrifying to villains and civilians alike. Morrison says that Reed, quote, quite rightly blamed himself for Ben's shocking deformity and loss of a normal life, end quote. And his use of the word deformity speaks to the extent of Ben's loss of his old self. There is no possible return to normalcy for Ben. He is forever othered. According to Morrison, in the Fantastic Four, quote, the Marvel superhero was born, a hero who tussled not only with monsters and mad scientists, but also with relatable personal issues, end quote. Nevertheless, for all the Fantastic Four were depicted as a family, Ben was always sort of the odd man out. Sue and Johnny were siblings, and when Sue and Reed eventually got married, it became even clearer that Ben was somehow not like them. Reed Richards and Sue Storm had their hyper-American alliterative names and their phenotypically waspish good looks, but Ben was different. The Thing is a giant protector, a nearly identical figure to the Golem of Prague, but that connection is left unspoken. The Golem is a common theme in comic books, but in the case of the Thing, the similarities are thematic and stylistic, not explicit. Even before the writers began to hint that there was something more to Ben's background than the all-American pilot we first meet, he stood apart. In 2002, Marvel released a special issue of the Fantastic Four focused on Ben, called Remembrance of Things Past. Ben returns to his roots, to Yancey Street in the lower Manhattan neighborhood in which he grew up. The issue begins with a flashback to Ben's youth. He's running with a bad crowd, breaking windows, including one in the shop of a Mr. Scheckerberg. Ben's older brother, Danny, tries to give the shopkeeper some money to forget the incident, but Mr. Scheckerberg calls them hoodlums. And Ben stops Danny from assaulting the man by promising to work weekends in the shop to pay for the damage. The first few pages flit through scenes from Ben's childhood, interspersed with silent panels of the adult Thing walking the empty streets. As we witness Ben and his mom getting the news that Danny had been killed in gang violence, the well-meaning police officer tells Ben, God took him to a better place. Ben replies, but God left us here, didn't he? Next, we see a slightly older Ben getting his induction into the Yancey Street gang, which required him to steal something from Mr. Scheckerberg. Ben holds up the man's personal Star of David necklace, which Ben swiped. The panel zooms in on Ben's eyes and his hands holding the dull gold necklace. The comic then moves to the present, where the Thing tells an even older Mr. Scheckerberg that he's there to offer protection, which Mr. Scheckerberg tries to refuse. We flash back to teenage Ben, now the leader of the Yancey Street gang, being abandoned by his friends and having them throw garbage on him since he moved in with his, quote, fancy uncle, the doctor, on his way to, quote, become some hotshot pilot. As yet, no one has said the J word, but the clues are mounting. He targeted the Star of David. His uncle is a fancy doctor. Back in the present, a sort of bam-pow superhero fight takes place, culminating in Mr. Scheckerberg falling down, possibly dead. The Thing goes to his limp body, saying, can't tell if he's breathing, don't hear nothing. Me giving him CPR could crush him. Sheck could be dying and I can't do nothing. No, there's one thing. Let's see, it's been a while. At this point, the Thing does the only thing he knows how to do, which is to begin reciting the Shema. Mr. Scheckerberg recovers, they have some banter, and the Thing reveals that part of why he came back was to return the necklace that he stole. He tells Mr. Scheckerberg, this doesn't mean I'm going to start going to temple again, but the implication is that he has reconnected with some lost part of himself. Mr. Scheckerberg asks if the reason the Thing's Jewishness was never in the press is that he was ashamed. The Thing's response is quite telling. Nah, that ain't it. Anyone on the internet can find out if they want. It's just, I don't talk it up is all. Figure there's enough trouble in this world without people thinking Jews are all monsters like me. Ben's desire to keep his Jewishness separate from something he thinks is shameful is a direct mirror to Stan Lee changing his name to save his real name for real novels. Mr. Scheckerberg turns the idea of monstrosity back on itself, saying, remember the tale of the golem, Benjamin. He was a being made of clay, but he wasn't a monster. The Thing acknowledges that he has been masking, probably for many reasons, but at least one of them was because of his perceived monstrosity and the way that might impact other Jews. He sees himself as a horror, while Mr. Scheckerberg sees him as noble. On the final page, the Thing scoops up Powderkeg, the villain he had fought in the middle of the issue, who says to him, you're really Jewish? The Thing responds, there a problem with that? To which Powderkeg replies, no, it's just, you don't look Jewish. The heavy subject matter ends with a lighthearted joke, as a way of signaling that the revelation that the Thing is Jewish should not be taken by readers as anything serious. Yes, his secret Jewish identity has been revealed, but the Thing is still the same lovable pile of rocks he always has been. Rough, from the street, a former gang member, but also Jewish. The revelation of the Thing's Jewishness is part of a larger movement toward embracing the things that the Comics Code Authority had previously obscured. By 2002, the CCA was all but dead. Although it didn't disappear entirely until 2011, fewer and fewer publishers worried about having it on their books, and almost no consumers made their buying decisions based on the presence or absence of the seal. Comics publishers no longer feared being accused of mocking religion by showing a gang member or a criminal to be Jewish, and Jewish publishers and artists no longer feared overexposure if they included Jewish characters in their work. Marvel has continued to lean into the opportunities offered by the Thing's new, not-so-secret identity. In 2006, they ran an issue called Last Hand, in which the Thing is hosting a superhero poker night. The issue is mostly an excuse for Marvel to have all of their favorite characters together in one room, interacting in a way that they never could in their own storylines. 2/3 of the way through the issue, the Thing's girlfriend tells him he's going to win because, quote, today you're the man. And then we flash back a few months. Mr. Scheckerberg is back, and he takes the Thing to temple, the very one he said he was not going to start attending, to meet with Rabbi Lowenthal. They ask him if he would like a bar mitzvah, since it's been 13 years since his transformation into the Thing. He agrees, and, quote, every weekend I was back in Shecky's store getting some private one-on-one Sunday schooling. Every weekday I was going to Hebrew school, and every spare moment I was practicing my Torah and Haftorah portions with Rabbi Lowenthal. The next page is an amazing image of a synagogue packed with superheroes. His aunt and uncle are holding hands and crying, as the thing stands on the bema in his talis and kippah and gives a Devar Torah about Job. Ben Grimm's secret identity was never his name. The Fantastic Four, as public figures with superpowers, reset the paradigm in terms of what secret identity was or what one meant. Some claim that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby envisioned the thing as Jewish from the outset in 1961, and that does appear to be true, at least for Jack Kirby, but they would not have felt comfortable revealing that at the time. The thing is a monster with a shocking deformity. And under the rules of the CCA, it's probable that Marvel would have worried that revealing such a monster as Jewish could be construed as ridicule. Furthermore, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and the other Jewish comics creators were all hiding in plain sight. The publication of Michael Chabon's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, in 2000 had brought the conversation around Jewish comic book writers and their creations back into the zeitgeist. So that could be one of the things that led to the Thing's 2002 unmasking. Ben Grimm is an excellent example of a character whose Jewishness developed well into his history, and it was a way to humanize an otherwise inhuman character. The next example shows this Jewishness as humanity theme even more clearly. Magneto is, in many ways, the best example of a character with a Jewish identity that dare not speak its name. When he first appeared in 1963, it was as the primary antagonist to the newly created super team, the X-Men. In the mythology created by Lee and Kirby, there are mutants among us, and their mutations normally manifest at puberty. Additionally, Ari Caplan has argued that, quote, not only was X-Men a resident metaphor for adolescence, but it was also an allegory for prejudice, as society hated and feared them for being innately different than everyone else. The X-Men are a metaphor for the ethnic other, end quote. Unlike the Fantastic Four, who were all American and universal, the X-Men spoke to the outsider. Ironically, the feeling of being different or outside turns out to be every bit as universal as the Fantastic Four's hegemonic normalcy. And while the X-Men were not an immediate success, their readership grew steadily over the decades. From the beginning, part of what made Magneto interesting as the adversary of the X-Men is that he and Charles Xavier, the X-Men's leader, both believed they were trying to help mutants. Xavier, Professor X, runs a school for mutant children and wants to turn mutants into helpful tools society will be willing to accept. Xavier is an idealist who refuses to give up on the idea that humans will come to appreciate mutants if the mutants can only become useful enough. There's a near codependent desperation in Xavier's approach when you look at it closely. His belief that someday, somehow, humans will accept and tolerate mutants, and until that day comes, mutants must do most of the heavy lifting in terms of repairing the relationship, carries with it a certain uncomfortable quality. It echoes pervasive narratives that see minorities as needing to meet the majority halfway and change or minimize their differences in order to fit in with society. It's the mentality that gave us terms like colorblind and melting pot, both of which eliminate or obscure diversity to achieve harmony. Magneto, on the other hand, quote, believes that humans have waged war against the mutant population and that mutants must respond in kind. His actions are all undertaken in the name of mutant freedom. The conflict between Charles Xavier and Magneto has sometimes been described as a metaphor for Dr. Martin Luther King's ideological arguments with Malcolm X. And Magneto and his Brotherhood of Evil Mutants are fighting for themselves against a world that has rejected them. They believe mutants to be superior to humans, and that it is time for them to assume their rightful place as the alpha species on the planet. Magneto is not evil because he's bad. He's evil because he's fed up. Magneto did not arrive in 1963 with a fully formed backstory, but Marvel invested a great deal of time and effort into making him not just a supervillain, but an anti-hero. Grant Morrison, who wrote an X-Men arc in 2001 and therefore knows the characters well, writes that Marvel, quote, had spent some considerable time developing the arch-villain from his origins as a one-note terror merchant in 1963 to a sensitive romantic anti-hero, end quote. Part of this process of humanizing Magneto, as already seen with Ben Grimm, was the gradual revelation of Magneto's Jewishness. By the 1980s, Magneto's rage against humanity had an origin, the Holocaust. While in most cases it would not need to be clarified that a survivor of Auschwitz was Jewish, Marvel hedged their bets. Magneto's wife Magda, that's in the wrong place. There we go. Magneto's wife Magda appeared in an issue of the Avengers in 1979, and we learned that she was a Holocaust survivor, although it's made explicit that she was Romani. In I, Magneto from 1981, In I, Magneto from 1981, Magneto acknowledges that he too was at Auschwitz and that his entire family was slaughtered, but the comics do not clarify why Magneto was in the camps. So while he may be Jewish, he may also be Romani or a member of any other persecuted group. In an X-Men arc in 1985, during which Professor X is missing and Magneto is actually leading the school, Magneto accompanies Jewish mutant Kitty Pryde to an event at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Magneto comments that then it was the Jews. My nightmare has ever been that tomorrow it will be the mutants. Magneto's singular mention of the Jews as the victims of the Nazis could be telling, or it could be because that's the focus of the Holocaust Museum. It's leading, but not a definitive expression of Jewishness. According to Jewish writer of that issue, Chris Claremont, they were being purposely cagey. In an interview, he said, quote, the reason we decided to err on the side of tact, discretion, use whatever word you like in that regard, was that we weren't playing with our character per se. He was a pre-established character, a Stan character, a Stan Jack character. So we didn't want to mess around with the core of his origin to that great an extent, certainly without getting a green light from Stan. The X-Men film franchise had bought into Magneto's Jewish backstory as early as 2000, but the comics steadily refused to confirm that narrative. Bryan Singer, the Jewish director of the first two X-Men films, had used the Holocaust as a frequent motif. And in X-Men, quote, Singer explicitly draws parallels between the Holocaust survived and connived by Magneto and chapters from US history that resulted from mass hysteria and fears of groups allegedly posing a threat to the American way of life. Making Magneto explicitly Jewish on screen made artistic sense for Singer. But the fear of revealing something that significant about such a long-running comics character kept that backstory from making it onto the page. It was not until the Magneto Testament was published in 2008 that the comics finally acknowledged Magneto's Jewishness. The Magneto Testament was a 5-issue standalone arc published from September 2008 to February 2009. It detailed Magneto as a young boy growing up in Nazi Germany. His affinity for metal is hinted at throughout the 5 issues, and the writer leaves it up to the reader to determine whether at one pivotal moment, Max survives a hail of bullets that kills the rest of his family just by luck, or because of a first outburst of mutant powers. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, who created Magneto, were Jewish. Chris Claremont, who spent years complicating Magneto and introduced the idea that he was in the camps, is Jewish. But it was non-Jewish writer Greg Pak who finally and definitively unmasked Magneto as a Jew. Jewish fears over surplus visibility, combined with the desire to keep the X-Men universal and applicable to any persecuted outsider, kept the writers from unmasking either Magneto or themselves until the weight of evidence was so overwhelming that to not admit Magneto was Jewish became more of a problem than admitting it. Although you could argue that these examples represent the attitudes toward masking of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby almost exclusively, it was not only at Marvel that the Jewishness of comic book characters followed this pattern. Over at DC, Joe Kubert and Robert Kanigher, Jewish comic book writers around the same age as Lee and Kirby, developed a new character, Ragman. Ragman #1 appeared in September of 1976, and anyone with a knowledge of American Jewish history would have wondered if the character was Jewish. His name, Rory Regan, certainly was not, but his backstory was. Regan is the owner of a pawn shop called Rags and Tatters, and in the first issue, we learned that he opened the shop as a tribute to his father, who had been a junk man. He wheeled a cart around New York City collecting rags and discarded items, which is an occupation commonly associated with Eastern European Jewish immigrants to New York. Kubert and Kanigher went on record that Ragman was explicitly not Jewish, despite, like Magneto, having such a classically Jewish origin story. Ragman's initial run was just a 5-issue miniseries, so his crypto-Judaism would have remained only speculation had DC not brought the character back in 1991. When Ragman returned, it was with an extremely Jewish backstory. Harry Brode discusses this change in his book, Superman is Jewish. Brode argues that, quote, when the Thing came out as Jewish, it was the most notable such revelation in comics. But the oddest conversion from non-Jew to Jew is the Ragman. Kubert still says today that he and Kanigher had no intention of creating a Jewish character, but to me, the later development of the character is a striking example of how the creator's background can manifest itself in the creation without the creator having explicitly intended it, end quote. The text on the first issue of the rebooted Ragman reads, from the ashes of the Warsaw Ghetto to the back alleys of Gotham City, the tatterdemalion of the oppressed rises again. Ragman is still Rory Regan. He still runs the rags and tattered pawn shop built on the junkman career of his father. He still becomes the Ragman after a brutal attack. Only this time, his attack is interwoven with the legend of the Golem of Prague. After Rory is shot and believes he's dying, he has a nightmare of his time in Vietnam, and he hears a voice saying to him, Emet, Hebrew for truth. Emet is the word used to bring life to the Golem of Prague, so its invocation here is a clue to those with knowledge of the Golem legend as to what is going to come. After the Emet Golem dream, Rory awakes to discover that he nearly died and that his father did die. He goes to the cemetery to find his father's grave, and he leaves a rock on the headstone, as is traditional for many Jews. The issue ends with Rory opening a box in his father's shop and finding a suit of rags. The following panel is a tombstone with Emet carved upon it, and we're left with a full black page broken up by bits of cloth as Rory becomes the Ragman in reality and not just in his visions. As with Remembrance of Things Past, this issue is saying that the main character is Jewish without significant, or in this case, any use of the word Jew. A Jewishly literate reader would infer from the multiple references to the Warsaw Ghetto, the rocks on the headstone, and the Emet motif that Rory Regan is Jewish in this iteration. None of those references, however, is so blatant that a reader unfamiliar with Judaism would definitively infer the character is Jewish. The second issue contains no clues to Rory's Jewishness until the final pages. The Emet motif returns, and when Rory sees it written inside the Ragman suit, he exclaims, there it is again, the Hebrew word for truth. But what does that mean? I've heard of the legend of Golem, but I'm not a clay man with letters carved in my head. I'm only flesh and blood. On the bottom right-hand corner of the penultimate page, we see the beginning of a response. Oy, what a challenge I find myself facing. The final page, then, is a full-page image of a man in a yarmulke who tells Rory he's there to train him. The word Jew or Jewish has still not appeared, but this is an image that communicates to most readers, including those with minimal Jewish literacy, that Rory is Jewish. The cover of the third issue is an image of the gate to Auschwitz, with its Arbeit macht frei logo at the center of the cover. The text on the cover reads, it's Warsaw 1941, and the people call for a hero to save them. The first Ragman emerges to battle an evil he cannot defeat. The stranger from the end of the second issue tells Rory, I am your beloved rabbi, and you are my loyal apprentice. And on page 3 of the issue, the authors retell the story of the creator of the original Golem, Rabbi Judah Loew, beginning with the words, in the ghettos of Prague during the 16th century, life for Jews was less than ideal. It took that long for the word Jew to appear in print in relation to Ragman. As with the Thing and Magneto, Ragman's unmasking as Jewish seemed inexplicably difficult, that's inexplicably difficult to say, for his creators. Kubert and Kanigher had no problem saying that the first version of Ragman was not Jewish, but it was much harder for Robert Loren Fleming, the author of the second iteration, to articulate fully what he was clearly hinting. In the tiny text of the editor's note at the end of Ragman #1 from 1991, DC Comics editor Kevin Dooley writes, finally, an odd coincidence. Leo Keel of Brookline, Massachusetts, commented in old #3s, so back in 1975, Old number three's letter column that despite his non-Jewish name, Rory seems to me, at least, to be the comic's first Jewish superhero. I like the idea. Mr. Kanigher had stated, if Rory was meant to be Jewish, he'd have a Jewish name. Rory is of Irish descent. Of course, being Jewish is more than a name, and that's not what Mr. Kanigher meant, but in this present version of Ragman, Rory is definitively Jewish, his powers heavily rooted in the Kabbalah. The authors and editors may have thought that they were being obvious with Rory's unmasking as a Jewish hero, but in reality, it still took them 3 months, if one was reading as the issues came out, to write the word Jews in the comics itself. By 1991, DC had already stopped including the Comics Code seal on their titles, so they were no longer bound by any of the CCA's guidelines. The apparent fear of coming down on the wrong side of the CCA was gone, and Robert Loren Fleming is not Jewish, so it's unlikely he had any concerns over Jewish surplus visibility. The slow unmasking of Rory Regan more likely represents an ongoing sense that making a character explicitly Jewish runs the risk of alienating some readers. So publishers and writers tiptoed around that particular identity marker, leaving religion secret as long as possible. The most notable exception to this rule of masking Jewish comic book characters is Kitty Pryde, a member of Marvel's X-Men. She was introduced in Uncanny X-Men number 129 in January of 1980. And the first time she's drawn, she's very clearly wearing a small Star of David necklace. She was conceptually Jewish from her inception. And while some writers focused on her religion more than others did, her Jewishness has never been masked. Although Chris Claremont would go on to be cagey about whether Magneto was Jewish, in part, as he claims, because Magneto was not his character originally, he had no such worries with Kitty Pryde because he created her. And while not all of the X-Men writers have given attention to Kitty Pryde's Judaism, Chris Claremont is one of the writers who most consistently portrays Kitty as a religious Jew. Kitty Pryde's Jewishness is not only visible, but it's functional. In Uncanny X-Men number 159 from July of 1982, the team needs to rescue their team member Storm, who has fallen under the spell of Dracula. Kitty is in Storm's bedroom when Dracula comes to claim his bride, and she does what any child who has seen a horror movie would do. She grabs a cross and tries to repel Dracula with it. They are both shocked when it doesn't work. But Dracula tells her, "Little fool, you have outsmarted yourself. The cross has no power over such as I if the wielder does not believe in it. You are no Christian, but a Hebrew." Wolverine similarly tries making a cross out of his blades later in the issue with the same result. Only Nightcrawler, who, as I mentioned, is canonically Catholic, manages to repel Dracula with cross. Kitty, however, has other weapons at her disposal. When Dracula tries to grab her, her Star of David burns his flesh. The comic establishes that it isn't the cross itself, it's the presence of any object in which the holder believes. So Kitty's star works just as well as Nightcrawler's cross. Kitty's explicit Jewishness had an impact on the Jewish unmasking of Magneto as well. It was her desire to attend the event at the Holocaust Memorial that drew Magneto to attend. She was there on behalf of her grandparents, who were Holocaust survivors. Magneto accompanied the teenager, so it was her Jewish identity that pushed Marvel closer to unmasking Magneto. His choice to join the only conceptually Jewish member of the team at an event for Holocaust survivors was read by many people as an implicit admission that Magneto was Jewish, even as Marvel continued to try to claim he was not. Because Kitty Pryde never needed to be unmasked, Claremont and Marvel could gauge whether there was any backlash against a Jewish superhero. I would be remiss, however, if I did not mention that gender undoubtedly played a role here as well. Women and girls in comic books have not traditionally been as popular as men and boys. So whether they consciously considered this or not, they were taking less of a risk by creating a young Jewish woman than they would be by changing a beloved male character like Magneto. Nevertheless, despite Kitty Pryde being the most recently created of the 4 characters I've discussed, she was the first one to be visibly Jewish. Each of her predecessors had a secret Jewish identity that required unmasking, while she and her Star of David stood Jewishly unmasked from her inception. One of the reasons superheroes have been so popular and successful is their universalism. The idea was that any little boy, because let's face it, comics were not written for girls initially, could see himself in those heroes. Anything that smacked of particularism, therefore, was anathema to comics. Jeffrey Johnson, in Super History, said that what made the Fantastic Four unique, quote, was that they were more human than any other superhuman that had preceded them. They fought super menaces and stopped criminals, but they also bickered amongst themselves and faced personal problems that many readers could understand. Their universalism was the major selling point and became the model of what Marvel and DC published for decades. Stan Lee believed that readers wanted heroes like them, and that meant not making heroes like him, a Jewish kid from New York. So while Tom Morris may be right that the Fantastic Four do not mask the difference between their private and super personae, the Thing, Magneto, and Ragman were still being masked by older Jewish fears of overexposure. Jack Kirby always thought the Thing was Jewish. Magneto was always the voice of those who had been oppressed and were not going to take it anymore. Ragman's backstory was Jewish in every detail except his decisively Irish name. The eventual unmasking of these characters built on decades of Jewish backstory elements and hints. Once fear of Jewish overexposure began to wane and Jewish writers began to develop some of these characters, new Jewish storylines began to appear. As the number of characters with multicultural backgrounds grew and it became clear that readers would tolerate and even welcome diversity in their heroes, the unmasking of Jewish characters became safe. Only Kitty Pryde wore her Jewishness on her body from the beginning, but her body was already not that of the imaginary adolescent boy the publishers saw as their target audience, so her religious difference had less potential downside. Throughout the Silver Age of comics and into the Bronze Age, identity politics shaped comics publishing. DC and Marvel realized there was money to be made in characters who spoke to minority groups. Black Panther premiered in 1966. Red Wolf, the first Native American superhero, debuted in 1970. Hispanic villains were a comic book staple from the beginning, but by the mid-1960s, Hispanic superheroes were becoming common. One by one, the publishers sought to include new cultures, backgrounds, and ethnicities. Yet, even though the writers and executives were largely Jewish, the unmasking of Jewish characters lagged far behind the celebration of other cultures. From a monstrous golem with no apparent connection to Jewish folklore, to a Holocaust survivor who was possibly Romani, to an immigrant rag and junk peddler who was unnecessarily Irish, comic book writers wrote their Jewish histories into the stories and then made conscious choices to mask their Jewish characters. It has taken decades to reveal the hidden Jewishness of many of these crypto-Jewish characters, and the continued success of these characters after their unmasking shows that fears of either the CCA or surplus visibility long outstayed their necessity. Thank you.
That was really, really wonderful, Dr. Caplan. And I see that we already have some questions that are trickling into the Q&A.
Great.
I'll give folks another second to put questions or comments there. I will say I, as a Milligan, am particularly taken by Ragman and his Irish name because it's exciting to see the Irish Jewish community represented.
Just for you.
Thank you. So we have a question here from Sarah who writes, I was wondering if you knew if Captain Marvel and Captain Marvel Jr. were Jewish as well, or if they are just two characters that fight against Captain Nazi to fight against anti-Semitic views.
That's a great question. They are not, at least at the moment. That can always change. That's the nice thing about comic books is you can pretty much retcon anything at any point. But no, those characters were not designed as Jewish. A lot of non-Jewish characters have fought Nazis, including notably Captain America. The character of Red Skull and Hydra, just as a blanket thing, Hydra has always been a sort of Nazi stand-in. So there's been a lot of Nazi fighting throughout the history of a lot of these characters. It's one of the things that makes the character of the Scarlet Witch interesting as well. She is one of Magneto's twin. Magneto and Magda had twin children that Magda gave up shortly after or immediately after they were born because she was afraid of Magneto at that point. It was very kind of Padme Amidala and Anakin Darth Vader situation going on. And so she gave the twins away to hide them. And so Wanda was not raised with any kind of a Jewish identity. She was raised with a Romani identity, but then she joined Hydra. And so there's been a lot that's been written, especially recently since WandaVision premiered on Disney Plus. There's a lot that's been written about this idea of her as a Jewish Nazi, and the kind of crossover there. So there's a lot of interesting Nazi fighting that goes on in Marvel, but those characters are not meant to be Jewish.
That actually leads in really well to another question here from Rachel, who asks, is there a surprisingly high number of Holocaust survivors and descendants in comic books? Do you think that this is related to how much Holocaust commemorization has been universalized?
That's a great question. And commemorization is more Rachel's area of expertise than mine, so I appreciate her bringing that idea up. Maybe it's just because it's on my mind because of the last couple of days, but I think some of that probably has to do with Mouse. Mouse, the first volume of Mouse was published in 1986. And so this visual way of representing Holocaust in sequential art became very, if not just normalized, but kind of, it became more highbrow, right? I mean, Mouse is the only graphic novel to have ever won a Pulitzer. So while Stan Lee is saying, oh, nobody likes comic books, they're lowbrow, people didn't want their kids reading them, all of a sudden Mouse comes along and wins a Pulitzer Prize. So taking on something like the Holocaust specifically has this cachet suddenly that comic books in general, sequential art in general, didn't have before that. So I think that that's probably a part of it. But I think you are also right about the way that Holocaust commemorization has become a less particularistic cause or visual over the years.
I think we have time for one last question, and we have one here from Bob, who writes, if one watched Arrow, even though Rory was in just a few episodes, one would not have guessed that Rory was Jewish despite his exposure as a Jew many years before. Do you think this was done purposefully?
I'm going to have to go back and look now because I could have sworn there was at least one episode with Rory where he and Felicity had a Jewish conversation, something off it. I don't remember if it was something about Hanukkah, something, but I'm 98% sure that Arrow did drop that at one point, that there was some conversation he had with Felicity, who was also Jewish on that show. I think the real shame is just that Arrow so badly misused the character and did not at all tap into what that character could have brought to the show in terms of backstory and identity and interest. But I think that they did hint around it. But they certainly didn't do anything especially foregrounded with his Jewish identity, which I think was a choice, and I think was a bad choice ultimately.
It's hard to believe that our time is already coming to a close, Dr. Caplan. This has been such a delight and joy for so many of us. And I think you can see as you get a chance to scroll through the chat too, that there's a lot of affirmation of your work and some other great questions too. I want to thank you for being with us tonight, and I want to thank our wonderful audience for coming. I know 7 o'clock on a work night, school night can be tough, but on behalf of the Institute for Jewish Studies and Interfaith Understanding, thank you. And I hope that some of you will also join us for our future events. Please join me in thanking Dr. Caplan.
Thank you all for coming.